my pleasure to thank you for joining us as we welcome a very special guest back to Utica College. First, a few announcements. For those of you who parked at ConMed, a reminder that the buses will be waiting in front of Strable Student Center where you were dropped off at the end of the evening. Next, I'd like to thank tonight's sponsors, and they are from Utica College, our campus theme committee. You can hold your applause until the end of this list. The provost cabinet. This one you might want to applaud for because I'm the director of this one, the Raymond Simon Institute for Public Relations. The Radisson Hotel, ConMed Corporation, the Observer Dispatch, and of course the Dockwoods Jazz Quintet. A few other special thank yous. Tonight's ushers are Utica College students, who you will see are wearing shirts designating them as the Pitts crew. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank Joe Ferriello, who is sitting somewhere down here. Stand up. Joe provided the spark and energy and a little bit of cash and a lot of pushing and organizing, and has wanted and had a vision that we bring Leonard here the first time and that we bring him back again. So he is the source. You heard me mention the Utica College campus theme. Each year, the college selects a theme that provides members of the college community with opportunities to explore subjects of social importance in depth. This year's campus theme is Many Cultures, One Community. Sounds like Utica, doesn't it? Which I hope you will agree ties nicely into the topic of tonight's talk. Leonard Pitts' career spans 35 years and reflects a level of accomplishment few columnists have achieved. He began his professional life at the age of 14 as a freelance contributor to Soul magazine, a national African-American entertainment publication, where he became editor. It sounds like there was a subscriber in the audience there. I heard excitement. At 19, he earned his English degree from the University of Southern California and went on to become a full-time entertainment journalist with work appearing in TV Guide, Reader's Digest, Musician, Spin, and many, many other publications. He joined the staff of the Miami Herald in 1991 as its pop music critic and began writing his nationally syndicated column on pop culture, social issues, and family life in 1994. In 2004, Mr. Pitts received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. We have an enthusiastic fan base here. In addition to his Pulitzer, he has earned numerous national awards for journalism and commentary, and we certainly could anoint him and list them all, but we'll highlight a few. The National Association of Black Journalists Award for Excellence, the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award for Commentary Writing, and the National Society of Newspaper Columnists Inaugural Columnist of the Year Award, and that's really only just a few from a very long list. Mr. Pitts is also the author of a number of books, Becoming Dad, Black Men and the Journey to Fatherhood, which was published in 1999 and provides a thought-provoking look at Black fatherhood in America from both a journalistic and personal perspective. He's published his first novel, Before I Forget, to broad critical acclaim in 2009, and a collection of his essays from this moment forward, selected columns 1994 to 2008. He also has a new book coming out in May called Freeman, and we're looking forward to that. So if you would please join me in welcoming Mr. Leonard Pitts. To join us on stage.
Thank you, Professor Landon. And let me echo what you have said. We're very excited to welcome Leonard Pitts back to our campus. From time to time, we honor individuals for their outstanding contributions to society by conferring upon them an honorary degree. Tonight is one of those times. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Pat Swan, Dean of the School of Business and Justice Studies, who will present our candidate for an honorary degree, Mr. Leonard Pitts, Jr.
have contributed much value to our national conversation on a broad range of issues. In an era seemingly dominated by overheated rhetoric, you have used your mastery of the written word to shed light on the human experience and provoke thoughtful reflection on the part of your many readers across America. You began your writer's journey as a very young man in South Central Los Angeles. In the years that followed, your byline appeared in some of the most recognizable names in popular media. You also became a prolific writer for the radio, producing an award-winning documentary on the history of Black America. Your work at the Miami Herald as a syndicated columnist has garnered some of the highest honors bestowed upon a writer, including the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. You have been duly honored by your peers numerous times in numerous contexts. Your work succeeds on the remarkable strength of your voice as a cultural commentator, but also because you possess an uncanny ability to connect with your readers and bring them together. You demonstrated this most forcefully with a column you wrote in response to the September 11th attacks, a defiant piece that warned the authors of that awful day, quote, "We'll go forward from this moment, sobered, chastened, sad, but determined too." Your resonant, clear-eyed prose has touched the lives of so many by reminding us of our shared humanity and by always striving to show the way forward. It is therefore with great pride that I present you with the honorary degree, Doctor of Letters, honoris causa, and all rights and privileges thereunto appertaining, and direct you to be vested with the appropriate hood. In witness thereof, this diploma signed has been issued and the seal of the college affixed. Issued by the Board of Trustees upon the recommendation of the faculty at Utica in the state of New York, this 18th day of April in the year 2012.
Utica College Board of Trustees, with the faculty concurring, I confer upon Leonard Pitts, Jr. the degree of Doctor of Letters, honoris causa, and all rights and privileges pertaining thereunto. I present him with this diploma signed and the seal of the College affixed, and direct that he be invested with the appropriate hood this 18th day of April in the year 2012.
With your speaker, Dr. Leonard Pitts.
And after all of that, now I'm supposed to stand here and give a speech, right? I'm really ready to go home, to tell you the God's honest truth. I can't top that. Thank you so much. I have never been so pleasantly suckered in anything I've ever done or in anything I've ever experienced in life. You really got me. Thank you. Wow. I can't wait to call my wife. You're going to have to treat me with a little more respect, honey. I'm not just honey, I'm Dr. Honey at this point. Utica College, thank you very much. You do me deep and profound honor, and I appreciate it greatly. Wow. Okay. Maybe I've got to shift gears now. See, it's not good. I would like to, there's a few people I wanted to single out. Joe Ferriello has already stood for just thanking you for bringing me here. President Hutton and members of his fine staff and educational community, I want to thank you all for bringing me here. I also wanted to single out a new friend of mine, Kieran Allen. Kieran, could you stand for a second, please? He is your what, senior class president? Yes. Yeah, but I present him to you, ladies and gentlemen, the 49th President of the United States. Watch and see if I'm wrong. And I would also like to say I've had a pretty good day here on your campus, an excellent day as of a few moments ago. I've had a pretty good day, except that I've been harassed repeatedly by a group of your students who have been after me to join their cult. This cult is called Twitter. Would my harassers please stand? Guys right here, stay away from them. Avoid them at all costs. Again, thank you very much. We live in a nation where it is possible on any given afternoon to turn on the television and hear a discussion of infidelity, incest, molestation, fraternity, alcoholism, etc., and etc. So I find it very interesting that as a nation we seem to be, the one subject we seem to be scared to touch or scared to discuss is race. Especially given that race is the subject that underlies our greatest and most ruinous war, and also was the subject of arguably our greatest social revolution. And yet the fact that we are hesitant, to put it mildly, to discuss this or to approach this subject is pretty obvious if you simply look around. I have had more than one reader tell me to stop talking about this subject because it is quote-unquote not polite, which I find a very interesting choice of words. I've also had, at this point, it's got to be hundreds of readers to tell me that talking about race makes me a racist. To which I usually respond, if that is the way it works, then I will begin talking about money. So that I might become a billionaire. All of that said by way of saying, I want to thank you for frankly, for what shouldn't be an act of courage, but for what is, being here to have a discussion about one of the most important issues of the American story. There's an old axiom which goes something like this. On the north side of the street, a group of young black men are walking together, baseball caps swung around to the back, talking loudly and brandishing a bat. On the south side of the street, a group of young white men are walking together, baseball caps swung to the back, talking loudly and brandishing a bat. Which one is the street gang and which one is the baseball team? We had a real-life version of that scenario, that question, play out on February 26th in the town of Sanford, just outside Orlando, Florida. We are all familiar with that case, of course. A man named George Zimmerman, captain of the neighborhood watch, sees a young black man in a hooded sweatshirt walking in the rain. The young man, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, is, according to what Zimmerman told a police dispatcher, walking slowly and looking around. Zimmerman finds that suspicious. Much of what happened after that is in contention. Did Zimmerman chase the boy down, initiate a confrontation, and then shoot him? Or did the boy come up behind Zimmerman, sucker punch him, and begin to beat him down, whereupon Zimmerman had no choice but to shoot him? As an observer, I have to tell you, I find that sequence of events to be of secondary importance. I am less concerned about the parts of the story that are in contention than about the one that is not. So let's forget for a moment all that back and forth about the rest of the sequence that led to the boy's death, and let's go back to the beginning. A teenage boy in a hoodie, walking slowly and looking around. And I ask you, is that the behavior of someone who is suspicious? Or is it the behavior of someone who is lost in an unfamiliar neighborhood in the rain? Trayvon, remember, was looking for his father's girlfriend's house. What does it suggest to you that the possibility that this boy was simply lost never seems to have crossed Mr. Zimmerman's mind? What does it suggest to you that he leapt so easily and so automatically to the conclusion that the boy was up to no good? What does it suggest to you that after the shooting, police did hardly any investigation? They left witnesses uninterviewed and evidence ungathered. They wrote up a report which identified Trayvon as the subject, which in cop speak means the suspect or the perpetrator, and then that they let Mr. Zimmerman go. What does it say to you that the vast majority of African Americans, when they learned of that story, reacted in anger? That black men and boys saw in Trayvon's fate a fate that too easily could have been their own? What does it say to you that many, not all, but many white Americans responded more coolly, that they have pronounced themselves tired of this story, and that some have even undertaken to sully Trayvon's image after death, viral emailing fake images of him as a thug, combing his Twitter account and using his suspension from school for a relatively routine infraction to make him out as some sort of so-called gangster, as if they are offended by the image of him as a clean-cut kid who aspired to go to college and have a career in aviation, as if they are desperate to forcefully make him the menace to society that George Zimmerman wrongly imagined him to be. To survey that gap in perception, that black and white gap in perception, is to be reminded of the famous quote from the Kerner Commission of the 1960s about how the nation is moving toward two Americas, black and white, separate but unequal. But my address to you takes its title from a different quote out of that same era, this one by Martin Luther King Jr. It is actually something he said rather frequently, including in his letter from a Birmingham jail. where he put it as follows: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." It's hard to imagine somebody arguing with that. It seems like a self-evident truth, but it also raises an obvious question. If life is interrelated, as Dr. King said, if you and I are just different threads in a single garment of destiny, why do we find it so difficult to act like that, to act that way, even now in the year 2012? Why do we find it so difficult to agree on which is the baseball team and which is the street gang? Which is the suspicious gangster up to no good, and which is the lost boy trying to get home in the rain? The answer, of course, is a four-letter word: race. It is a word that explains everything, and yet, at the same time, explains nothing at all. Last year, I taught a course at Princeton University. The title of the course was Writing About Race. On the very first day of class, we did an exercise in which I projected pictures on a screen of a number of famous or accomplished people. And I asked my students to answer what they thought was a very simple question. Is this person whose face you see on screen white, or is this person African American? So I showed them Charlize Theron, the beautiful blonde and blue-eyed actress who won an Oscar for playing serial killer Eileen Wuornos in the movie Monster. She is white, they said confidently. Yeah, but Theron was born in South Africa and became a naturalized American citizen in 2008. Does that not make her African American by definition? I showed them Idris Elba, the dashing chocolate-skinned actor who became famous playing the drug dealer Stringer Bell in HBO's The Wire. He is African American, they said confidently. Well, I said he is black, or at least he is dark-skinned, but his father is from Sierra Leone, his mother from Ghana. But he actually grew up in East London. Does that not make him African British? I showed them John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. He is white, they said. By this point, they were no longer speaking quite so confidently. Yes, I said, we would indeed consider him white, but he is, or he was, an American of Irish ancestry. For a long period of time, this country did not consider Americans of Irish ancestry to be white. The same is true of Americans whose ancestry was Hungarian, Southern Italian, Slavic, or Jewish. I showed them Whoopi Goldberg, the dark-skinned actress with dreadlocks who won an Oscar for her role as the fake psychic Oda Mae Brown in the movie Ghost. African American, they said. Well, yes, I told them you could call her that, but be aware that she rejects that term. As she said in an interview a few years ago, I'm not an African American. I'm purebred, New York raised. I'm not from Africa. So I showed them more pictures. I showed them pictures of Walter White, a pale man with blonde hair and blue eyes, and Gregory Howard Williams, another pale man, balding with dark hair. By this time, I think my students were feeling a little bit put upon and maybe a little bit wary, so they were hesitant to give me answers with too much confidence. This was smart of them. Walter White, the man with the blonde hair and the blue eyes, was the head of the NAACP. His autobiography, A Man Called White, begins as follows, quote, I am a Negro. My skin is white. My eyes are blue. My hair is blonde. Gregory Howard Williams wrote a book too. It was called Life on the Color Line. In it, he reveals that he didn't even know he was black until he was 10 years old. That's when his parents split up, and his father was a fair-skinned black man who had been passing for a dark-skinned white man. His father told him the truth. In the book, Williams wrote of how he once went to his white grandmother, asking her to put him in touch with his mom. He had not seen his mom since the breakup of the marriage. His grandmother turned her grandson, this boy who looked about as black as black as Justin Bieber does, she turned him away from the door. "I don't carry messages for niggers," she said, talking to her grandson. I was talking to one of my students a few days after that, and he praised that exercise with words of eloquence that are available only to the very young. He said simply, "Wow, that blew my mind." He told me he had grown up thinking of race as something that is fixed and immutable, and something that is so obvious you don't even have to think about it. Look at that guy with the dark skin. Of course he is black. What else can he be? Look at that blonde with the fair skin. She is obviously white. What else could she be? That student and several others told me that this exercise had forced them to question the things that they thought they knew. It had shaken them up in ways that they had not expected. And of course, I was very pleased to hear that, because that is exactly what I had set out to do. We all need to be shaken up with regard to how we process this thing we call race, and that its cousin, that thing that we call ethnicity. We regard them as self-evident, and we imbue them with all manner of meaning. But I'm here to tell you that in the absolute sense, there are few things in human history that have less meaning. I'm here to tell you that of all the truly stupid ideas human beings have developed in their centuries on this planet, arguably the most stupid of them all is race. And if you doubt that, then I offer you a simple challenge. Define race. Tell me what black means and what white means. Tell me in such a way that your definition cannot be destroyed in one or two questions. Do you want to define black as having African roots? Charlize Theron has African roots. For that matter, we all have African roots, according to science. You want to define it as dark skin? I refer you once again to Walter White. You want to define it as natural rhythm? Somebody give me a beat, I will dance for you, and we will put that to rest very quickly. So let's move on then, and let's try to define white. Is it pale skin? Gregory Howard Williams, whose grandmother turned him away from the door with that awful statement, Gregory Howard Williams has pale skin. Is it European roots? Well, Idris Elba has European roots. You want to define it as a lack of natural rhythm? Well, let me just say one word in response to that. Elvis. The fact is that as a scientific matter, by any means of objective quantification, race has absolutely no meaning. As a cultural matter, of course, it positively seethes with meaning. It defines privilege, life expectancy, education, crime, faith, health, history, media, interpersonal relationships, banking, employment, entertainment, and pretty much every other avenue of everyday life. It is the dumbest idea human beings ever had, and yet at the same time it holds us and molds us and shapes us at who we are and how we see the world to a degree that virtually nothing else does. And if you wonder where that comes from, well, it's simple. It's very simple. Race is an invention. The inhabitants of Europe, who began flocking to this land in the 17th century, did not regard themselves as white. They were Scottish, they were French, they were Portuguese, they were English, they were Spanish. And they had no particular sense of common cause with one another. To the contrary, they were in contention with one another to determine which could best exploit the riches of this new land. One of their tools of exploitation was a system of free labor they developed. Initially, they subjected white men and women, convicts and apprentices and the poor, to that system of indentured servitude, where a person would work for a prescribed number of years and then be set free. But those white men and women who were under the system of indentured servitude came to understand the flaw in that system. What's to stop me from going free anytime I choose? I'm in a new land where there are no legal structures and systems set up. What's to stop me from, going to the next county or the next state or the next territory and being free? I can disappear into the vastness of North America and stand a good chance of never being found. There was also an attempt to use the native tenants of North America as free labor, but that did not work out so well either. The natives had low immunity to the diseases that were brought here by the Europeans, and they died at alarming rates. Enter the Africans. As people from Europe did not see themselves as white, these Africans did not regard themselves as black. They were Mandinka, they were Songhai, they were Tuareg, they were Fulani, they were Wolof, Mende, Balanta. But when they were kidnapped, sometimes betrayed by other Africans, but far more often captured outright, and when they were kidnapped and taken to America, then they learned or were given a new identity. That's when they became Negro. That's when they became black. As one historian puts it, I've always found it such a profound statement. One historian said, Africans did not become enslaved because they were black. They became black because they were enslaved. In a similar sense, Europeans did not become slave owners because they were white. They became white because they were slave owners. In other words, these two arbitrary designations became the justification for one group of human beings to elevate itself above another group of human beings, and for the second group of human beings to be treated as if they were not human beings at all. So the second group could be worked and whipped and raped and cheated and disenfranchised and beaten and maimed and shut out and jailed and killed, and the second group could commit these crimes, or members of the second group could just simply sit back and watch these crimes committed and enjoy the fruit of their commission, and yet never feel the slightest twinge of conscience, never feel that they were anything but good and moral people. Because after all, the second group is black and the first is white, and that explains it all. That allows it all. Now this makes about as much sense as if brown horses decided that they were superior to black ones, or calico cats decided to elevate themselves above white ones. That's what race is. That is the power with which we have imbued this artificial distinction. You want to know, as an objective, quantifiable fact, that the things that distinguish black from white in this country? Black folk have more susceptibility, to sickle cell. Whites have more susceptibility to skin cancer. Maybe there are one or two others, but that's pretty much the limit of what I can come up with. That is it. Everything else we know or think we know about what distinguishes black from white, all that talk about natural rhythm and white men who can't jump, and black men who can't conjugate, and saying ax instead of ask, and crime and education, do you name your daughter Heather or Sarah, or do you name her Tanisha or Ebony? All the rest of that stuff is just environment, culture, media, hype, perception, and misperception. The differences we have been taught to think of as absolute simply do not exist. So you should ask yourself, then where did we learn these things? Who was the teacher, and why were we such apt students? To some degree, the answers to those questions seem simple. We were taught that black was inferior because it justified and helped in the physical, economic, and political exploitation of an entire group of people. If blacks are inferior, and if that is encoded into law, then as a white guy, as a white worker, or a white money individual, here are millions of people that you no longer have to compete with for jobs or housing or economic security or political power. These people are off the table, along with the Native Americans, along with the women of whatever stripe. Here's another group that we don't have to compete with. For four centuries, this lesson has been taught, pounded home like a hammer driving nails. We were taught these things in church sermons, and newspaper and magazine articles, in radio broadcasts, in movies, in books, and in TV sitcoms, in schools, and online. Many white people came to believe it without question. And if we're going to be perfectly honest with one another here, we have to admit that many black ones came to believe it as well. That's what you are hearing when you hear one black child tell another to, quote, stop talking white. Or when you see them describe getting good grades as acting white. It is what you are seeing when African Americans talk about good hair, meaning that hair which looks like white people's hair. Or when you see some African American celebrity who has used chemicals or photographic tricks to lighten his or her skin. It is what you are hearing when you hear African Americans refer to themselves by a certain 6-letter epithet and that would not be a stranger to the Ku Klux Klan, and then rationalized by telling you it just means brother when we say it. This is what is going on when Shaquille O'Neal says in an interview how embarrassing it is to be dunked on by a white guy. Because you see, physical and athletic superiority, we have been taught, that's within our proper purview as black people. But I guarantee you, you will never hear a black person say how embarrassing it is to be out-conjugated or out-subtracted or out-additioned by a white guy, because we have been taught that is within the proper purview of white people. And as cruel as this act of deception has been where African Americans are concerned, African Americans have not been the only victims of cruelty in this charade. Nobody speaks about this, but the white underclass, poor white people, have also been the victim here, having fallen prey to an ingenious con job which told them something like this: you may have no money, you may have no education, you may have no prospects, but you do have your whiteness, so you are part of the club. Again, you have to remember, while you and I may look upon a person with pale skin and automatically designate that person as white, that was not always the case in this country until well into the 20th century. As I taught my students, if you were from southern Italy, you were not white. If you were from Poland, you were not white. If you were from Ireland, you were not white. If you were from Hungary, you were not white. If you were Jewish, you were not white. As the historian David Roediger observes in his book, Working Toward Whiteness, quote, "White is something immigrants were required to learn. They did this by changing their names, by giving up their accents, by abandoning old world customs," end quote. And they did it also by distancing themselves from black people, by learning the language of racial epithet, and by engaging in acts of oppression. In Working Toward Whiteness, Roediger recounts what happens when David, who is a Jewish immigrant from Russia, arrives in Americus, Georgia, to join his cousins who are working as peddlers. They have a little business as a peddler. And his cousins criticize David, the newcomer, for treating his black customers with too friendly an attitude. He's a little too familiar with the black customers. One cousin tells him, quote, "The Schwarzes here are like we are in Russia. Do you understand? They are to Goyams, Jews, outcasts, nothing, dirt." David refuses to buy into this notion of white supremacy. It is easy, he tells his cousin, for you to forget how to feel and what it was like to be hurt and stepped on when you think of yourself as white today and forget what it was like being a Jew yesterday. His cousin does not disagree, but he still insists that David should let the Goyim show him how to handle these blacks. Besides, he says, is it so bad that they should hate someone else for a change? Nor is this parsing of whiteness, this earning of whiteness, just some dark, dusty artifact of history. As recently as about 22 years ago, the Los Angeles Times ran a story which found that immigrants from Asia, South America, and other places we do not ordinarily deem quote-unquote white were claiming that designation on the forms that they filled out to come to this country. As recently as last year, a Muslim man discussing the tide of Islamophobia that has overtaken this country since 9/11 lamented to me what he saw as his people, Muslim people's, biggest miscalculation. "We thought we were white," he said. Because in America, whiteness is privilege. It is entree into the club. And if you want to know what makes it a con job, ask yourself this. Did Joe Smith, newly arrived from Poland where he was known as Joseph Sosnowski, really believe this gave him something in common with Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, J. Pierpont Morgan, our Andrew W. Mellon, or any of the other moneyed interests that ran this country? It did not. My favorite example of this con job, as I call it, is the Civil War. These days, people like to pretend that the Civil War was fought over some abstract cause, but the plain truth is that it was fought over slavery, the right to maintain slaves in the South and to expand slavery into the new territories to the West. This is what the states of the old Confederacy themselves said. This is how they explained themselves when they seceded. It is what the leaders of the Confederacy said when they broke this country in two. None of them was more plain about it than the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, who said, and I quote, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition." So this was a war about slavery, but poor white men owned no slaves. How could you get them to sign up to be cannon fodder in a war to defend what they did not have? You tell them it's a war for states' rights. You tell them it is a war to protect their homes from northern invasion. You tell them it is a war to defend whiteness itself from the dangers of mongrelization. And true enough, they will go out for you and they will die for you in grotesque numbers because this promise of whiteness was that important to them. You see this again and again in American history. In the decades after the war, when poor whites began to rise and want to organize and demand better wages and better living and working conditions, it was the doctrine of white supremacy that hammered them back into line. Racial division was used to keep the Italians from aligning with the Hungarians, from aligning with the Poles, from aligning with the Irish. And the ultimate threat was that if any of them got too far out of line and misbehaved, they would be fired and their jobs would be given to the African Americans. African Americans were sort of the nuclear threat. And again, if you think that's ancient history, think again. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina swamped New Orleans, a telling thing happened. As recounted by Tim Wise, Tim is a noted author and lecturer on race and white privilege. The storm devastated two communities that sat on opposite sides of the canal. One was the lower Ninth Ward, which is predominantly black, and the other was Chalmette in St. Bernard's Parish, which is predominantly white. Both of them pretty similar economically. Both of them hard-scrabble, working-class areas with very high levels of poverty. Both of them devastated by the storm. But after the storm, with people displaced and no one knowing who was going to end up where, Chalmette did something very interesting. It passed an ordinance saying that you could not rent property in this predominantly white, economically distressed area to anyone who was not a blood relative. I will leave it to you to determine who that was meant to keep out. Remember, there's no electricity yet in Chalmette. The water is not yet on, but this was the first ordinance that they felt necessary to pass because whiteness was that important to them. As a matter of economic survival, these poor working class whites surely had more in common with the poor working class blacks on the other side of the canal than with any other given class of white persons. But they did not see it that way because whiteness wasn't that important. And here, let us return to Martin Luther King, because while everyone knows what he said about his dream at the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963, everyone knows what he says about the mountaintop at Mason's Temple in April of 1968. Few people know what he said about this July and pumpkin strategy that has kept us apart for so long. What he said on a podium outside the State House in the state of Alabama in 1965. At the end, this is at the end of the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Dr. King says this: "If it may be said in the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said in the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man, and he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow sign on the buses and in the stores, on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. Thus, the threat of the free exercise of the ballot by the Negro and the white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. It segregated Southern money from poor whites Christianity. They segregated Southern minds from honest thinking, and they segregated the Negro from everything. With apologies to Malcolm X, the point here is that poor white people have been tricked, they've been hoodwinked, they've been bamboozled, they've been misled. And while African Americans have been the most frequently used tool of that trickery, the ones most frequently used to further that trickery, African Americans have not been the only tool of that trickery. To the contrary, this country has never had a shortage of what the rapper Chuck D likes to call weapons of mass distraction, meaning those groups among us who we are told are the ones we ought to fear. Don't worry about your living conditions. Don't bother me about your wages. Don't bother me about your prospects. Here's something over here you need to fear. These are the people who are responsible for the meagerness of your lives. These are the ones who threaten everything that you hold sacred and dear. Once upon a time, it was the Jews. Once upon a time, it was the Irish. Once upon a time, it was the Poles. Once upon a time, it was the Germans. Once upon a time, it was the Japanese. These days, it's the homosexuals. These days, it's the Muslims. These days, it's the illegal immigrants. And it has always been the blacks. Black folk have never gone out of style. That's the most reliable boogeyman in American history. But if you know this, then you have to ask yourself, in what rational universe is a 17-year-old boy in a hoodie more of a threat to you, more viscerally offensive to you, than predatory lending practices which may cost you your home, than complex and deceptive financial instruments which drove the American economy off a cliff, than 45 million Americans without access to health care, than school systems which are turning out children who are not equipped to compete in a global marketplace, than a war on drugs that has cost us $1 trillion, made 40 million arrests, and yet seen drug use rise by 2,800% in the last 40 years. Than a military stressed by a decade of wars, one of which never should have been fought in the first place, than the rich getting richer while the poor keep on getting poorer, and then a national debt which as of Monday stood at exactly 15 trillion, 614 billion, 994,767,843.32. And yet the threat to our existence is Trayvon Martin walking home with a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea, or Sarah and Tanisha who love each other and want to get married, or Halima and Muhammad who want to live quietly and worship at their local mosque as is their First Amendment right. Weapons of mass distraction. Back in the late 90s and early O's, the nation suffered through a string of tragic school shootings in places like Pearl, Mississippi, Eugene, Oregon, West Paducah, Kentucky, and most notoriously, Littleton, Colorado. Virtually all of the neighborhoods where these shootings took place were white. Virtually all of the victims were white. Virtually all of the shooters were white. Yet when we mourned those murders and contemplated their causes, no one identified this as a white problem. These were American kids killed in American schools, and this was an American problem. In 2006, a 9-year-old black girl named Shardavia Jenkins was playing at the front door of her home in inner city Miami when she was shot in the neck and killed in the crossfire of a shootout between two gangsters. I wrote a column in which I described urban violence like this as, quote unquote, an American problem. I got dozens of responses, emails from white people, some of them presumably of Irish, Jewish, or Southern Italian heritage, who wanted to correct me. This was not an American problem, they said. It was a black problem and black people needed to fix it. And isn't it interesting how even this late in the story, some of us still hold black over here and American over there. We sing Motown songs, we buy Michael Jordan shoes, we root for Kobe or LeBron, we watch Oprah on television, we get our news from Don Lemon on CNN, we read great literature by Ernest Gaines, Walter Mosley, and Toni Morrison. We count ourselves lucky if we get to sit in classes taught by Henry Louis Gates or Cornel West. We take Martin Luther King Day off in January. The definitive moment in our history is a war that freed the slaves. We are led by Barack Obama, and yet black is over here and American is over here. It is time, and yes, it is past time. We heard what Martin Luther King tried to teach us about the interrelatedness of life, about what it means to be tied in that single garment of destiny. When he died, Dr. King was in the planning stages for what he called the Poor People's Campaign. He was looking beyond the artificial barriers of race and beginning to grapple with the structural components of oppression across all races. He was organizing poor Latinos, poor African Americans, poor Native Americans, and poor white Americans, encouraging them to look beyond the superficial things they had in contention and come together upon the very profound things they had in common, namely the fact that they were all poor, all economically exploited. Before that could happen, of course, Dr. King went to Memphis to organize on behalf of the striking sanitation workers. He was shot and he was killed there. And from that day to this one, 44 years later, the nation has never again approached the place he sought to push us to. I challenge you, I challenge me to see that place, to seek that place, and to seek common cause with those who superficially are not like you, to make yourself impervious to the weapons of mass distraction, and to demand that those who are around you do the same. And let me speak for a moment specifically to young people in this audience, because whenever I have these discussions, young people come up to me or they speak in the question and answer session, and they say something like, I want to do everything that you're saying, but I have no idea how to do it. How do we go about making this change? And I want to say now what I tell them all the time, you know, your grandparents, back in the halcyon days of the 1960s, fought the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, started the gay rights movement, the anti-war movement, and helped to drive a corrupt president out of office. And all they had by way of technology was rotary dial telephones and mimeograph. He did not say Xerox, he said mimeograph machines. You guys don't know anything about a mimeograph machine. You gotta crank that puppy and watch the stuff. You know, matter of fact, the flyers for the Montgomery bus boycott were mimeographed. They run off on a mimeograph machine. With that, they changed the world. So I find it difficult, you know, you young people, and I'm not scolding you, but I am trying to teach you, you have more communications power right here than anybody in the 1960s ever dreamt of having. You have more power to reach, to teach, and to do whatever, to organize, than anybody had right then. So you ask me, how can I do this? I ask you, how can you not? The world is smaller now than it was when Dr. King was still with us. It is smaller now than it's ever been, than it ever was before. I carry this tiny device on my hip, which allows me to communicate and receive news and information from pretty much any continent on Earth. We did not have that when he was here, so his words are, if anything, more true now and more urgent now than they ever were before. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. So what does that mean? What that means is this. On September 10th, 2011, I would be willing to bet that most of you were not thinking about the grievances of radical Muslims on the other side of the world. And then suddenly, it's not on the other side of the world, it's in New York City, it's in Washington, D.C. And their grievances have come home to us, and we've been grappling with them ever since. Sherdavia Jenkins, the young lady that I told you about who was shot and killed, and people told me, well, that's not an American problem, that's a black problem. Well, excuse me, but do you think that there are gates or fences on Sherdavia's neighborhood that keep the people that shot her from coming to your neighborhood and shooting you? Do you really believe that you are not going to pay a price, if not in blood, which you may well pay, but if not in blood, at least in taxes, in higher insurance premiums, and frankly, in your sense of well-being? How dare you say that you can segregate this problem over here and it has nothing to do with us? All life is interrelated. Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin being shot, well, that has nothing to do with us, some people will say. Trayvon Martin, the reason that George Zimmerman was not initially arrested was the so-called stand your ground law, which says that a person has the legal right to shoot and kill if that person has a reasonable fear for his or her life, okay? That's a license to murder in the way I look at it. And guess what? That license to murder does not say anywhere on it, only 17-year-old black boys, okay? All life is interrelated. Black and white, Jew and Muslims, gay and straight, we are all threads in that garment of destiny. And you know how it is with threads. You pull one loose and the whole garment unravels. I suggest, I argue, I implore that we don't let that happen. I suggest, I argue, and I implore that we reach up for the wisdom that has eluded us all these years. We begin to question the importance that we attach to all of these superficial barriers and differences and distances. We work to locate the humanity in those who are not like us. And so, step by step, increment by difficult increment, we vindicate the ideals that we hold sacred and dear. If we do that, ladies and gentlemen, we thereby build a world that is safe for garments of destiny and more forgiving of lost boys walking home in the rain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I feel bad stealing any of that thunder that he deserves more of. Give him some more. We're giving you an honorary degree, so we have one more honor to give you. And that is, we're making you a member of the Pittsburgh. We had an opportunity for some people to submit questions, so if you would like to join the press.
So we have a number of questions here that have been submitted in advance. I'd like to, on your behalf, ask Mr. Pitts. The first, Bill Cosby said this week that he believes the Trayvon Martin case is about guns, not about race. He said that calling George Zimmerman a racist doesn't solve anything. That talking about his behavior with guns is a better focus for the debate. Would you comment on Dr. Cosby's opinion?
I'm Dr. Pitts now, so I'm not terribly impressed. I agree with him in one aspect. I disagree with him in others. yes, obviously it's about guns and about the access to guns, but I think it's a mistake to say it's not about race. But the mistake that I think he makes, and the mistake that many of us are making, is acting as if the issue here is whether or not George Zimmerman is some closet, Klansman with a hood in the closet. I don't know and I don't care what George Zimmerman is, in terms of race. That's immaterial. The dirty secret of the Trayvon Martin shooting, and if it had happened this way, we'd not even be talking about it. But the dirty secret is that Trayvon Martin's shooter could well have been black. He could have been black, had the same dynamic work, because what's at issue here is not George Zimmerman being this frothing racist. What's at issue here is that we are a nation that so readily conflates black men with crime. Okay. And the secret, why I say that he could have been as readily black as anything else, is that black people are not immune to this socialization. I think there's a tendency among white Americans to believe that African Americans, particularly African American kids, are somehow immune to this, and they are not. If you have grown up in this country and you've seen on television and online and in the movies and in books and on the news and everywhere else images of people who look like you as thugs and or basketball players rather, and or rappers, you are pretty well going to assume that those are your options in life. Okay, you're going to pretty well assume that that is who you are. And that the adults around you are going to assume these same things. There is no immunity or imperviousness to that. So, I don't care about what was happening in George Zimmerman's mind when he shot that boy. What I care about is what gave him the right to feel like he had what gave him the belief that he had the right to stop someone who is walking lawfully on a public street and say, explain your presence to me. That's what the issue is. That's what the issue is. And that does not require him to be some frothing racist. What that requires him to be is what too many of us are, which is people who readily conflate black with crime. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander has a line which just gets me every time. She talks about the fact that we have so readily conflated black with crime that the phrase white crime reads to us as nonsensical, while the phrase black crime reads to us as redundant. Okay, that's what's happening with regard to Trayvon Martin. This whole thing about did Zimmerman utter a racial slur as he went chasing after the boy is so immaterial to me. It's not even funny. I don't care about that. I don't care about Zimmerman's state of mind. What I care about is, why did you think you had the right to stop somebody who's walking? You've already called the police. You've done your civic duty. Why did you feel like you had the right to demand, that he justify himself to you? Do I have the right to stop you? Would anybody, can I stop you and demand that you justify? If I'm not a sworn law officer or a security guard, I'm a guy who's declared himself president of the Neighborhood Watch, and I am, by some reports, the only member of said Neighborhood Watch. Where in any of that do I have the right to stop you on a public street in the United States of America and say, justify your presence to me? That's what bothers me.
Another question in advance. What role should the media and public officials play in comments that incite violence against the President of the United States?
Media, are pretty much trapped by their own need for the sensational. So media are going to report those comments, which is their job, and then people like me, or who do my job, are going to decry them. But I think that politicians have a moral obligation, and frankly, a lot of them are not standing up for, to decry these kinds of comments. That every president takes abuse. Every president in my lifetime has taken abuse. Abraham Lincoln took amazing abuse, but Barack Obama is taking abuse of a character that I have never seen before or imagined. And when you say this, people always want to say, oh, well, you're just sensitive to him being, people criticizing him. I just criticized him. I just wrote a column about the drug war, which appeared today, and one of my favorite lines is, apparently the president neglected to engage brain before operating mouth, okay? Which strikes me as a fairly critical line. So it's not about criticizing, but when you are, as a public official, calling the president uppity, when you are, as a public elected official, calling the president boy, when you are, as an elected public official, sending out postcards showing the White House with a watermelon patch out front. When you are as an elected, we're not talking about the crazy folks yet. We haven't even talked about that. We're only talking about elected public officials. When you are as an aide to an elected public official sending out a postcard which shows 43 presidents in statesman-like poses, and the 44th president is represented with a dark square with white cartoon spook eyes, okay? Something's wrong there. Something is seriously wrong there. And I think that, you know, our political leaders have been, perhaps because they're enjoying the fruits of it and the votes that come from it, but our political leaders, certain political leaders, have been shamefully silent and shamefully complacent, not complacent with a C, complacent.
Another question. On the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr., your column recommended that everyone read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Can you talk about why you recommended this book?
Actually, it's on the anniversary, I believe it's on the birth, but yeah. I think that this book is the most important thing that I have read with regard to explaining what's happening in this country with African Americans. It's got to be the most important thing I've read, and I don't know when, maybe ever. And the reason I feel this way is this: what she does not say anything, or she does not show you anything that you have not seen or have not known if you're fairly cognizant of what goes on in this country. But what she does do is put it together in a way that allows you to see the big picture in a way that you never have. So that, for instance, you know, what I'm talking about is the fact that we know that African Americans are arrested in wildly disproportionate numbers as far as the drug war is concerned. African Americans account for something like between 13 and 15% of people committing drug crimes in this country, depending on how you want to slice the numbers. In some states, African Americans account for 80 to 90% of people doing time for drug crimes. Okay? In some states, an African American young man is 57 times more likely to go to jail for a drug crime than a white young man. Okay? This is the point that she makes, but then she also points out we have all these ancillary laws which came up, you know, after, you know, in the wake of the drug war, you know, part of our so-called Get Tough on Crime campaign, such that if you are convicted of a drug crime, well, then it's legal to discriminate against you in public housing. You can't be in public housing. If you are convicted of a drug crime, it's legal to discriminate against you in hiring. If you're convicted of a drug crime, you can be denied the right to go to school. If you've been convicted of a drug crime, you can be denied the right to get a loan. If you've been convicted of a drug crime, there's a whole litany of things that you can be denied. You take that litany and you look at the list of things that African Americans were segregated from during the years of Jim Crow, and what you find out is that it's very similar. Okay? The only thing is there are no signs over the water fountain saying convicted of a drug crime, not convicted of a drug crime. Okay? But pretty much everything else is tracking directly with Jim Crow. Under Jim Crow, you were segregated, you were not allowed housing, you were segregated in your housing, you were segregated in your employment, segregated in your education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what she is arguing, and what I believe is the case, is that the drug war functions as a de facto new caste system, a new system of Jim Crow. The thing you have to understand about racial caste systems in this country is once upon a time, it was okay to write in the law, no black people can do this, that, or the other. Okay, that was perfectly fine. Come the 60s, and that's not allowed. So what you have to do is to come up with a way of achieving the same result without using racial language. Richard Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, quotes his boss, and Nixon is the man that started the war on drugs. Haldeman is quoted his boss as saying, the whole key to the problem is the blacks. The whole thing, the whole problem is the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. So you look at that, you look at the numbers of the drug war, and you say, wait a minute, okay? You say, wait a minute. And again, the drug laws have nothing, there's nothing racial in the drug laws. There's nothing that says you can arrest the blacks but not the whites. But somehow that's the way it works out. It's reminiscent to me of the grandfather clauses. Anybody familiar with those? Okay, the grandfather clause is back when the Supreme Court, you know, when African Americans supposedly were given voting rights, certain states came up with ingenious ways to deny African Americans voting rights, but not use racial language in the laws. They came up with the grandfather clause, which said that you may not vote if your grandfather could not vote. What does this mean? Okay, my grandfather was a slave. Okay, so what does this mean? This means not only that I can't vote, but that nobody in my family will ever be able to vote. None of my children or their children or their children, none of them will ever be able to vote. Okay, nothing racial in that law, but the racial intent and the racial impact is certainly there. That's how the drug war is operating in this country, and it is a shame. I'll let you go to the next question in a moment. I tend to preach on certain topics, so forgive me. But I submit to you that if we had a situation where 1 in 3 American kids or 1 in 3 white American kids were being funneled into the criminal justice system for long sentences for the possession, say, of a joint or some small amount of marijuana, we would regard this as a tragedy, as a national, emergency. There would be think tanks, there would be white papers, there would be reports, there would be demands for action. And it is a shame on us as Americans, and it is a particular shame on us as African Americans that we have watched this and are watching this happen with African American kids, and nobody's saying anything. We're treating it as if it's normal that you go to a courthouse and look at the people lined up for drug crimes, and 80 or 90% of them are black. That's not normal, and it's not right.
This is a little bit similar, I think.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about the Martin Luther King Memorial, presumably in Washington, D.C.?
The King Memorial, I just saw it for the first time about maybe a month ago because I didn't want to go with the crowds there. I like the memorial. I think the thing about memorials is it takes some time to sort of find their level and to sort of find their place. I do think that quote on, everybody's familiar about the controversy on the quote on the side. I do think that putting that quote, truncating that quote like that was a really stupid idea. And I hear that they're going to get that straight, and I'm really glad about that. But in terms of the memorial overall, I think it's a beautiful memorial, but in terms of what it means, that's going to be for generations, that's going to be for some years to determine. You have to remember the Vietnam War Memorial, which is the most popular memorial in Washington, was controversial and was hated by people when it was designed and when it was built, and yet that's the one that people flock to and the one that makes people cry and the one that, that no one can leave Washington without seeing. So, my feeling is, I'd like to give it some time before I render a final verdict, but I saw it and I was moved by it.
So much of journalism today, especially on television and the internet, is actually a series of experts offering their opinions. It is sometimes hard to find reporting that doesn't offer opinion. As a journalist who dwells in the arena of opinion, do you think we have seen the end of objective journalism?
Well, a couple things. This is the fine point. I don't think there's ever been such a thing as objective journalism. Objective suggests no human judgment, and no endeavor involving human beings will be without judgment. I think that when we say objective, a better word is fair, by which I mean, journalism that strives to represent all points fairly without fear or favor. That said, I don't think we've seen the end of striving for fair journalism, but I think that it makes its home where it has always made its home, in that, decaying, decrepit, dying form we call the newspaper. That's where you find it. That's where you find, long form reports on things, on issues of importance to the country. Now, you'll find some, I guess, on PBS and various other rarefied places on television, but much of what you find on television is going to be somebody giving their opinion on something. And, it's structured such that, you can go to Fox if you are so inclined, or you can go to MSNBC if you are so inclined, and hear opinion that only validates, the opinion that you came in the door with and never challenges any of it, which I find to be a complete, waste of my time. I don't want to be someplace where all they're doing is validating me. I would like to be challenged. I think that this whole idea of partisan journalism is a contradiction in terms. You know, I really. I really have very little respect for that. But if you're looking for people who are at least trying to continue to be fair, your best bet is to spend some quality time with your local newspaper. All the reporters and newspaper reporters in the room clap, yes.
Oh, Chris, your head's going to be so big. One final question, and it's an opportunity to elaborate a bit more on your talk tonight. When it comes to race relations in America, do you think we will ever get to where we should be, and what will it take to get there? Will a change in the language we use to discuss race make any difference?
No, I don't have a lot of faith in changing the language. I think, you know, we've changed the language repeatedly over the last 100 years. What is it saying? When I was born, I was colored, then I became Negro, and I advanced to black, and now I'm African American. You know, and none of that has changed a whole heck of a lot. I don't really have a lot of faith. I don't have a lot of faith in changing language. Frankly, I think the fact that we can't decide what to call black people is evidence of the fact that race is not real. If something is real, you know what to call it. If something exists, you know what to call it. But we have never been able to find a term which quantifies all the stuff we mean when we say African American or when we say black. So I don't think I have a lot of faith in the language to change it. What I think will change it is when we decide to be intentional about changing it. When we as African Americans, I think one of the problems, one of the things that we as African Americans have failed to do is to, well, there's a number of things, but one of the things we fail to do is to make space for white Americans of goodwill to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I think we've become entirely too reflexive about including them out. And if you look at the history of American racial progress, white Americans have always been there on the front lines and have paid oftentimes with blood and treasure, you know, for African American freedom. You can go back to Elijah Lovejoy during the Civil War. You can look at William Garrison pre-Civil War. You can look at William Garrison during that era. You can look at Viola Liuzzo and James Reeb in the 60s. All of these people who gave much for African American freedom. So this whole idea that we seem to have evolved, at least in my perception, of including a sort of blanket dismissing white folk, is, I think, a bad idea. I look at, somebody asked me about how we bring, white Americans back to the table or ask them to be partners in this, and is it possible? And I speak at, 10, 15, 20 colleges a year, and I talk to a lot of kids, a lot of white kids, and I'm telling you, they're there. They're in this audience. These kids are there, they are earnest, they don't know a whole lot about the history or about what has happened, but they are eager to they have the idealism that young people always have, and they want to be part of a change. What the problem is that we have not, given them the structure for that. And when I say we now, I'm talking about all of us. We've not given them the structure for that. We've not given them, here's what you do. We have not, none of that has been done. We've not taught them the history, so none of those things have been done. But the kids are there, and they are ready to be involved. So I think that one of the things we need to do is harness that of the young people, or help them to harness it for themselves. And we also need to be very much more active about teaching this history. That's the other great failing. American history in general is being lost. I think I read a statistic somewhere that something like 54 or 53% of Americans think slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War, and at that point you just want to bang your head against the wall until you break the wall or your head or something. But the history is being lost. American history is being lost. African American history is being lost. And I am a firm believer that if you don't know where you came from, you have no chance of getting where you're trying to go. So I think that we need to, one, empower and require our schools to teach American history and African American history, which apparently have been cut back tremendously in recent years. And then we as African Americans, as a community, need to make it in our institutions, need to be about the teaching of our history. One of the many things I admire about American Jews is in Jews, internationally, is the fact that they've institutionalized Holocaust education. You cannot be you're going to have a lot of trouble being a Jewish kid, coming of age and not knowing anything about the Holocaust. But it is entirely possible to be an African American child and come of age and not know anything about Jim Crow, not know anything about the lynching era, not know anything about slavery, knowing very precious little about Martin Luther King. And I think that that's on us. My generation of African Americans, I think, dropped the ball in failing to teach these lessons to our kids and to kids in general. So those are, I guess, two of the things that I would say are, crucial that can be done.
Thank you.